Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. You are listening to the voice of one Evan Buck, and today joining me in a rare two-seater edition of A Fork in Time, I have the eminently affable co-host, Chris Capola, who probably has something to say to the good people.
Hi, good people.
All right. And now that we have an episode underway, it is honestly kind of rare for us to have only, two people. We have such a, a lot of hosts that join us. Robert and Dylan are unfortunately not available to join us today, but I think we're still going to have a good time with the crew that we have on hand. So today we're going to be talking about another topic that has spawned from, I believe this came from Napoleon's hemorrhoids props, again, if I am not mistaken. Dylan, thanks for finding that and throwing some of those topics in our queue. We are going to be going back in time, starting in the 1930s. And we're going to be talking about a very well-known individual in our timeline who goes by the name of Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan was born in 1911 in Illinois, and he decided to stake out after a brief stint in sports broadcasting, he moved to Los Angeles in 1937 to pursue his career in acting. Now, this is where our fork in time comes into play. In the 1930s, there was the Communist Party USA having a pretty decent presence in various sectors, and one of which in Hollywood, trying to infiltrate Hollywood, was a very big focus of their agenda. Reagan, of course, at this point, as most of us are probably well familiar with, he was a left-wing ideologue to a certain degree in the early years of his acting career before he became the well-known conservative Republican that he evolved into.
He was a New Deal Democrat.
He was a New Deal Democrat. He voted for Roosevelt 4 times. He was a good, faithful, loyal Democrat. So in the 1930s, he was recruited to join the Communist Party USA. At this point, he was just trying to get his sea legs. He was just trying to get his acting career kickstarted and established. So he was kind of interested in joining the party with some of his fellow struggling actors, but famously, the communists actually rejected him from their membership because he was being deemed as a featherbrain and unable to hold a political thought for more than 20 minutes. And actually, one of the film producer's wives commented, he said, "Hey, I have never met a more limited man, to put it politely. He was stupid. He was an actor who made a good speaker, but talking with him before and after events, this was a man who was not well informed or very knowledgeable. He was a personable performer." So Reagan was rejected from Communist Party leadership, or membership rather, and fast forward a few years to 1947, Reagan was able to get himself elected as the president of a powerful union, the Screen Actors Guild. And in this role, this was where he was able to kind of start establishing some of his political skills. And
this is where he became nationally prominent. He was a B actor. Mm-hmm. Most people probably didn't know who he was until this point, when he becomes the president of SAG.
Yep, he was mainly a B movie actor in the 30s and 40s. Then he did World War II. Mm-hmm. Oh, he was, mainly responsible for, in the Army Air Corps, he made some training films for pilots. I think it was something like over 400 training films. Mm-hmm. So after, he was discharged from duties, he then and with his election in the Screen Actors Guild, this was when his film career mainly got kickstarted, before he transitioned into more of a television actor. So a lot of how Reagan, cut his teeth really in political activism started as a liberal battling against communist influence in Hollywood as president of the Screen Actors Guild. And it's probably arguable that without the growth of the Communist Party in Hollywood, we would not have had the conservative icon Ronald Reagan that we know today. This was all happening against the backdrop of the Hollywood blacklist in 1947, the arrest of the 10, and we have McCarthyism going on here, the Red Scare. We have our favorite FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, and the FBI's anti-communist efforts. The Communist Party basically kind of became a well-known honeypot for the FBI and the CIA. They would basically catch and have a lot of informants within their ranks, essentially ratting out people who were sympathetic to communist leanings. So because of this, Reagan's non-communist affiliations and him being able to crusade against them, it prevented his career from being ruined, like a lot of other actors, and kept his credentials squeaky clean, all-American. So this leads us to the fork in time that we are going to be considering today. What if Reagan had been able to successfully join the Communist Party in the 1930s as a young struggling actor, following many of his acting friends? And with that, I will take a break from my soapbox and take a breath and give the floor to Chris to set up some of the possibilities of this fork in time.
So at this point being 1930s in the United States, membership of the Communist Party was secret. You joined, but you would have been known to other communists who saw you at meetings, but you were not public. Nobody outside the party knew you were. I think that's important because if he keeps it under wraps, and throughout the war, the communists were on our side, there was nothing wrong with being a communist. And in fact, a lot of people in the 1930s joined the Communist Party not because they liked communism, but because they hated fascism. And they looked at Spain and looked at Europe and said, the communists are the only people actually doing something. That's why I'm on their side.
So basically a complete pendulum swift reaction to, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, of the lesser evil sort of thing. That makes sense. I actually didn't know that. That's pretty fascinating.
And what we postulated is basically Reagan is still Reagan. He's still very good at making a speech. And he probably is able, at least into the early post-war period, able to win election as president of SAG, of the Screen Actors Guild. The only problem is something called the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. This was probably the first thing that happened in the second Red Scare. This was kind of the beginning of it. And it was a bill passed over the veto of Harry Truman that did a lot of things, but the important thing for us here is that it required anybody being elected to any position in union leadership to file an affidavit with the Department of Justice that they were not and had never been a communist. At this point, when that became law, everybody signed these as quickly as possible because the law did not say that a communist would be removed from office within their union. But to admit you were a communist was getting to the point that it would have led to that. So generally, anybody, and it turns out that it was more a perjury thing. It was generally used to get communist union leaders to sign this piece of paper and then commit perjury.
It's like getting Al Capone on tax evasion, right?
Yes. And so what probably we postulated happened is Reagan gets elected, and then he immediately is removed in a giant scandal when this comes out, that he had actually joined the party in the 1930s. So at this point, he's a non-entity. He's done. Yeah. Evan suggested that he might go back to sportscasting. If I'm being perfectly honest, knowing what I do about the United States of the 1950s and even carrying through to today, if you're a communist, bet the only job you can get is calling soccer games. They're not going to let you near football.
No, not at all. Because that is, you got the Cowboys, America's team.
No, you do not have the Cowboys yet. You are still true. 13 years from the Cowboys.
That is true. That is very true. But speaking more broad generalities, yes. Also, because we do not have a resident Houstonian here on the podcast, I can make reference to the Cowboys without having to censor it. But anyway, so we essentially think that none of the movies, Reagan is not going to be able to continue his acting career after this. And the primary focus of this episode, we feel, is more important to look at what happens in a political environment after, we have a Reagan-shaped hole moving forward. So, and this is where I think the meat and bones of the episode is going to take place. So I think, and Chris and I talked about this and we agreed on this before recording, that most anything major that happened in our timeline would still happen and take place much as it does, much as it did in our timeline and the alternate timeline without Reagan, the 40s, World War II, 50s, 60s, up until we get to 1966 would have played out the same. The first main off-ramp, the first main fork in time.
The first time we notice him missing.
Right, exactly. The first time we'll notice him missing is what gets Reagan into politics. And as a side note, because Reagan became a television actor and show host more in, the 50s and 60s, he was actually the host of a pretty popular show called General Electric Theater. And Robert Kennedy essentially forced GE to fire Reagan. And this is what propelled Reagan into politics. That's kind of another interesting fork in time that we could possibly do as well as follow-up if we wanted to, is what if Kennedy had not forced GE to fire Reagan? Because then I would argue we probably wouldn't have had a governor or President Reagan, at least not, as quickly as it happened in our timeline. But I digress. So no Reagan in the first off-ramp, 1966, the California's governor's race, which is in our timeline, the one that Reagan was able to win against the incumbent Democratic governor, Pat Brown, who had served 2 terms. And the central thing that we want to think about here is, if we have no Reagan in 66, how would that change that race? Would Pat Brown still win in, the Democratic primary? Who would the Republican opponent be? Would Pat Brown have won a 3rd term? And from what Chris and I talked about, Pat Brown, for the first 2 terms, was pretty popular, passed some major proposals, but things kind of started going south in 64 with the Watts riots and the Berkeley protests, the free speech movement. Those sorts of things were somewhat damaging to the incumbent governor. And Sam Yorty, who was the mayor of Los Angeles at the time, ran a pretty spirited campaign against the incumbent, but he still ended up losing in the primary. And as Chris noted in the pre-recording, I had a thought that maybe Sam Yorty might have been able to win in the primary, but Chris swiftly reminded me of the fact that Yorty was mayor of Watts, essentially mayor of Los Angeles, mayor of that area during the whole riot period in question. So Brown probably still would have won with the power of incumbency. So the Democratic primary. For For me, I kind of just took a somewhat lazy approach in determining who the Republican nominee probably would have been. The second place runner-up to Reagan was George Christopher, who was the last Republican mayor of San Francisco. Once he left office in '64, there has never been a Republican mayor of San Francisco since then. So if we have a Christopher versus Brown race, what do we think happens there, Chris?
I think you said Brown holds on, right?
I think personally Brown holds on, even though he's unpopular and even though he's been dealing with issues, as I think incumbency would still help him out. And Reagan, in my view, it kind of like, and I'm the resident Californian of this podcast. So I was barely aware of politics in 2003 with the recall effort. But what I do know is that with the recall effort in 2003, pretty much the only way you're going to get a Republican to win in this state is if you have them be an actor. And in which case we had the governor. We had Schwarzenegger, who was able to win as a result of that recall election, which had a bunch of very interesting one-time confluence of factors. And Gray Davis, in my view, was just the unlucky guy who happened to be sitting in the bench when all of these things happened. So he gets kicked out. Schwarzenegger gets it. To me, I feel like Reagan had such star power and he had such a, command to be able to swing a state that, and here's the thing, remember, California was not always the left-wing liberal bastion that it's well known as today. Ronald Reagan himself famously quips that Orange County was the place where good Republicans would go to die. And California was the state that spawned, Richard Nixon. And
I was going to say, who did Jerry Brown beat in '62? Nixon, exactly.
So, California wasn't always as liberal and left-wing as we think of it as today. But I think really this election was, in our timeline, we had a Republican Reagan winning. In this timeline, I think we can see the beginning of a shift, to more of California being, I think the central way of saying it is that we would have had a shift, the California leftward shift, I think, a little bit sooner than we ended up having in our timeline, with Brown holding on. So, okay, so California set in '66. We have Brown continuing, and that would be a whole interesting, if we already haven't lost our audience by this point, if we had a whole separate podcast on what would have happened to California after this point, we would have lost whoever would have stuck around up until this point. But fast forwarding a little bit now, 10 years later down the line to 1976, a lot has happened in those 10 years. And we do have a prominent Californian, Richard Nixon, the Republican, who, he ascended to the presidency. And a little thing known as Watergate kicks him out of office. Well, he has to resign, but he probably would have been impeached. And so we have Gerald Ford, who is the only president who was never elected, either as vice president or president. He ends up becoming the accidental president.
Just point of privilege. Why did he become president? When Nixon resigned.
Yes.
Why was he vice president when Nixon resigned?
Because Spiro Agnew resigned.
Only candidate from Maryland ever.
Yep. So we got a lot of interesting
Since
trivia
we're playing
there.
a home team, this is a home team episode.
Actually, that's fascinating. I didn't think about that because for those on the podcast who are unaware, I'm the Californian and Chris is the Marylander. So that just so happens to be a coincidence. That's pretty funny. So in '76, we have Ford running, as the accidental incumbent, and he wins the 1976 primary in our timeline against none other but Ronald Reagan. And Reagan was running on a more conservative, less establishmentarian, not Rockefeller Republican kind of ticket. And I would say it's unfair to portray Ford, as necessarily 100% aligned with all of those interests, but Ford and Nixon essentially kind of became a useful foil for Reagan as a Republican Party that was no longer working, a Republican Party that was no longer in the interests of everyday Americans. And Reagan ran a very strong insurgent campaign against an incumbent president. He did not win, but that 76 campaign really set him up to do well in 1980 and be able to win Reagan Revolution and usher in our timeline, the two-term Reagan presidency that we are very well familiar with. None of that happens in this timeline. So instead, we have a Ford in 76 who, although wounded, although dealing with, and I mean, Ford was the one who lamely said in one of his State of the Unions, the state of our union is not good. When you get to that point, you're cooked. Things are bad. Inflation is bad. South Vietnam falling, not great. So, and Ford, despite all of this, and this is something that Chris and I discussed in the pre-podcast recording, the biggest single factor that torpedoed Ford was his pardon of Nixon. Ford was very lucky to, be the beneficiary. He had, I think, 65% approval ratings at the beginning of his term because he was not Nixon. He was a good Boy Scout. He was, squeaky clean, no corruption. What ended up in our timeline hampering him.
Something interesting just went through my mind. The only president never to have had to campaign for it was also the squeaky clean one.
Well, you know what they say, correlation does not equal causation, but that's something to think about there. So, so Ford, in my view, the Nixon pardon was probably the single biggest thing that sunk his reelection.
The interesting thing that sunk him more than anything else. But for those familiar with the 76 race, there was also an issue in a debate where Ford said there was no Soviet domination of Poland, of Hungary, of Eastern Europe, which tanked him with basically urban, suburban Catholic voters, Polish, Hungarian, people who still had some ties back to the old country. That the fact that something as stupid and forgettable as that is one of the things looked at as swaying the election, he was in a lot of trouble already.
Yeah, exactly. So the first main question, which I think we dispatched pretty quickly, was no Reagan in 76 running against Ford. Is there any significant Republican opposition to Ford in 76?
No, I think basically everybody looks at this. Everybody looks at what's happening. Jimmy Carter is becoming a major player on the Democratic side. And I think most of them look at the situation and say, you know what? We're going to sit this one out. We're going to sit it out, and we'll just turn Carter into a one-term president. We don't want to run with the baggage of Watergate and everything else that it comes with. Ford's welcome to try. Fine. Let him, stand up to that, and he'll get destroyed.
Sacrificial lamb.
He will get destroyed, and then we can all come out of the woodwork in 4 years.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So I think the one major factor that we don't have in 76 anymore is the presence of a significant Republican challenger that is able to get himself a head start in the 1980 election. So, the same thing kind of happens in our timeline. Ford wins, no opposition though in the Republican ranks, and then he loses to Carter. Same one-term presidency of Jimmy Carter happens. So now we have the 1980 election. And if you just look at the Wikipedia page for the 1980 presidential primary, you see a massive sea of red representing who is now missing, Ronald Reagan. He's no longer there to sweep those states. The most significant challenger that we know pretty well is George H.W. Bush. Not really, pulling too many states. And of course, the remnant of the Rockefeller Republicans, as we deemed it in the pre-podcast recording, the Democrat in denial, John B. Anderson. He basically gets a few votes, and then he ends up in this election running third party. And as a little bit of trivia, Jackie Kennedy was probably a closeted Anderson supporter. It's pretty widely speculated. But be that as it may, no more Reagan in the 80 presidential primaries. What happens here? What we posit is there is still, and this comes up a lot on the podcast, there is the, key man or the major player, major man theory of history. There are people and there are instances where there are personalities and forces of personality in a single individual that are so strong that without them, it completely changes the course of history, versus more of the broad sweeps or the broad movements of history idea, which is there are certain forces that, absent certain people, it doesn't matter as much. The things would have happened the same, but just had a different person instead. In this one, I think Chris and I kind of came firmly on the side in this specific instance of the forces of history. We still feel that the conservative side of the Republican Party would have been more prominent in this election. And Chris, who did we say would likely be the Reagan-esque stand-in?
Bob Dole.
Bob Dole from Pancake Land, Kansas.
He was Ford's running mate in 76. He's United States Senator, very well placed. I think the other important thing is he's got enough red meat in him to throw to the new moral majority, Jerry Falwell types that are getting involved in the Republican Party, that are pushing for political power there. He can check enough of those boxes to pull in a lot of the Reagan voters. Reagan's not around, but his voters still are.
Absolutely. Yes. So we have a 1980 presidential primary on the Republican side that, again, I think the force and the persona of Reagan made it where it was, a 60% to 20%, for him in the primary. It'll probably be a little bit closer, between Dole, who is probably one of the most mild-mannered, steady as she goes personas in politics you could ever possibly have. So it would still result probably in his victory to become the Republican standard bearer, but it'll be a little bit more of a contest. So 1980 election, Carter versus Dole. I think it happens mostly the same as what happens in Reagan versus Carter, but Dole ends up becoming president instead. So this is where we think the biggest ripple effects are going to happen. And I'll just give a little preview, a little spoiler of coming events, because we'll, of course, talk through this and elaborate why. But I personally feel like this is going to be less of the policies are going to be majorly different, as it is going to be the personality is going to be majorly different. But even there, a different personality can have a big impact on what transpires, on what changes in this fork in time. So what are we dealing with on the world stage? But let's break it down domestically, foreign. What's going on in the 80s that a Bob Dole is going to be looking at, much like Reagan did?
So I think the most important thing in the 80 election happens as our Bob Dole is taking the oath of office. And in our timeline, this literally happened on January 20th, 1981. As Reagan is taking the oath of office, the hostages are in the air being released from Iran.
Mm-hmm.
I think the same thing happens. I think that still goes forward. Just because Iran wants to put their thumb in the eye of Jimmy Carter, regardless of who the next person is. I mean, let's be honest, looking at how it happened, right? Like, there was no love lost between the Iranian regime and
not
Ronald Reagan. There would have been none between them and Bob Dole, but we're just going to stick it to Jimmy Carter. That is settled very quickly through no activity of either one of them. But it helps. It helps that that's no longer an issue. At this point, the Soviets are in Afghanistan. That has already happened.
Yep.
The Sandinistas are in Nicaragua. That has happened.
Yep.
Those are the two big things. There is a Berlin Wall. There is all of the stuff we're familiar with throughout, all of the Cold War. And I think, Bob Dole, whatever else you want to say, to modern American listeners, I think the best comparison would be to John McCain.
Yes.
You cannot say that Bob Dole was not an outstanding national security American patriot.
You are not going to win against him on a national security debate. He's got those creds.
He's got those creds, and he is also a very steady, and, like we discussed, assuming he does pick his opponent of H.W. Bush in the primary, that's almost a national security dream team. Mm-hmm. And I think what you're going to have is them pursuing the policies, if not more confrontational on some of these things that Reagan did. The difference is this. H.W. Bush was our ambassador to China and then the director of Central Intelligence. Bob Dole was a United States senator from Wichita, Kansas. I'm not going to get into that, to Wichita versus Seattle, but it has a claim as the home of Boeing. Mm-hmm. So they're known entities. They're known entities as very strong, conservative, anti-communist, but they're known. Reagan comes out of nowhere. And I'm reminded a little bit of when Nixon resigned, the Soviet intelligence apparatus could not understand what was going on, because the idea that a president would step down because of legal problems, investigations, was completely
foreign to the Soviet mind.
Foreign to their concept. In the Soviet Union, when you get removed from power, when this happens, there are tanks circling the Kremlin there were with Khrushchev.
Literally cooked.
Yeah. They did not know Reagan. They had no experience with Reagan. He comes in and starts talking big, and they don't think he knows how to play the game. And so they think he's unpredictable. And I think that's the big difference between a Dole and a Reagan presidency. That Dole is very confrontational, but he's a little more, they feel they are more familiar with him, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. No, I could see that.
They're not worried about him just waking up and because his wife's psychic told him to launch the missiles, him launching the missiles. That was a legit concern of theirs under Reagan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. So I think with Bob Dole at the helm, maintaining a lot of those same policies, I think also, we discussed this as well in the pre-podcast, a lot of the actual, ramping up defense spending, Republican bread and butter, for a while, kind of issues are still going to be at the forefront, business friendly, those kind of things. But I posit that I think a big change, a small but meaningful change moving forward is something that was, very big that Reagan is known for, is a school of economic thought named after him, Reaganomics, right? And so he came in with a, lowering taxes, but also boosting defense spending kind of agenda. So as a result, we saw the deficit go up a lot. And I think, personally, with the Dole administration, you're going to have, and I don't necessarily know, and this is something that maybe could be a nuance as well, Chris, but like Reagan, of course, with his, I guess we can call it belligerence and unpredictability. He was very forceful when it came to things like, Star Wars, not the movies, but the whole space, defense program that we were interested in. Those kind of things. And then, of course, later on in his presidency, Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall sort of agenda. I think Dole probably would have maintained and kept up the defense spending. I don't personally know or feel if he would go for a sort of thing like Star Wars. But regardless, I think the key thing is a Dole administration would have applied much of the same tactics and much of the same, increasing defense spending. But the X factor that changes is that we do not have as substantial of tax cuts, if not no tax cuts. We just keep them the same. So, and this is again something that we also kind of discussed in the pre-podcast, is the term Reagan Democrat would not exist. There would not be that degree of crossover from union voters, the Democrats losing union voters the way that they did in our timeline. 1984, and this is getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but just, foreshadowing this fact, Reagan won, 49 states to 1 plus the District of Columbia, utterly just annihilating Walter Mondale, who was Jimmy Carter's VP. Because the economy was booming, the economy was doing great. You could say a lot of the reason was with the tax cuts, people getting a lot more money in their pockets. Economy was booming, but of course the deficit was ballooning, but we didn't really care. Economy was doing great. Mm-hmm. So Reagan sweeps. Dole doesn't have the same personality or force of character, and he'll be more steady as she comes. And so with the 1984 election, and actually before I get to that election, we also feel like some of the targeted, interventions are still going to happen. So you have the anti-Nicaragua campaign, you have the 1983 invasion of Grenada, probably still going to happen with much of the same results. But with no Reaganomics and, assuming economic trends are probably going to be similar, not the same though.
I think it's actually going to be, if you look at economics, deficit spending increases inflation.
Right.
Inflation was what was killing the United States in the 1980 election.
In the 70s and 80 election, yeah.
And I think you might even see because we talked about this, and the guiding principle of a Bob Dole is going to be his guiding principle that he expressed in the 1990s was balancing a budget. And that is kind of the rock-ribbed, small C conservative, business-minded. I mean, business people don't survive deficit spending.
Mm-mm.
They can't do that. And I think that will, first there's the cycles of the economy. As long as you don't have another oil shock, and as long as you maintain pretty steady economic policies, you're going to have inflation down. You're going to have a bit of a recovery starting by the time you get to 84. There's an argument to be made that with the inflation caused by Reagan's tax cuts, could have been doing even better.
There's a possible argument there. Mm-hmm. But I think and we again said this kind of in the pre-recording, with the forces that led to Reagan trouncing in the 84 election, we don't think that the 84 election is going to be as massive and by any stretch of the imagination a trouncing.
Keep in mind, it would be mathematically impossible for it to be more of a trouncing.
Pretty much. So, and I don't think we talked about this in the pre-recording, but operationally, and I think for the Democratic side in 84, and we didn't talk about this, but I don't think there really is a lot of room for anyone other than Mondale, personally. I feel like Mondale's platform would have changed a little bit because Mondale took a much harder tack of, and I don't know how he thought this was a good idea, but let's raise taxes, as a result of I kind of want to say it was like a knee-jerk response to Reaganomics. Mondale, I don't think would have taken that tact at all because we would not have had the, knee-jerk response. But let's assume, unless there's disagreement on that front, Mondale gets the 84 nomination. He still loses, but it'll be more like a 55-45, kind of popular vote margin. And we don't have him memorialized or remembered as being the guy who lost almost the entire country as a result. So Bob Dole Act 2, 1984. What do we think happens from this point? And I think this is kind of the point where we didn't discuss in detail in our pre-planning. So this might be a little bit where we kind of do some more spitballs. But the first thing that comes to my mind is when does Iran-Contra happen again?
Iran-Contra kind of comes out. It starts coming out 86-ish. And I think, for the lack of a better phrase, if you've got the National Security Dream Team, the same stuff happens, but it happens smarter.
Yeah, basically, it probably doesn't come out, and if it does come out, it's going to be later.
It's and you're much more insulated and everything like that. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So that may be less of a factor as it was in our timeline.
But the one thing, the other thing that does come out in Reagan's second term that would not be an issue under Dole would be probably some of the savings and loans and the Wall Street crashes that happened. If you don't,
because that happened as a result of a lot of the deregulation.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's huge. And Chris, this actually, I can't believe this slipped my mind during this whole time. And I'm just going to say, I'm going to take a step back to the first term here.
Okay.
Because something that was, I think, and this also will prelude a little bit into what we feel happens in terms of politics for the Republican Party as a preview of coming attractions. But I think a big part of why Reagan is so memorialized, and honored and enshrined as essentially a Republican deity in modern politics is, what he did in terms of like putting the Democrats on their heels, trouncing them in 84, Reaganomics, him being seen as this strong, leader against the Soviets. But the first part of that was in 1981, the assassination attempt, right?
Okay. Yeah.
That's something that we didn't talk about in the pregame. And I think let's take a step back and talk about that here. I think that was something that was really important as an event in terms of helping him get a lot of that popular support. Because I'll just say, a lot of people kind of forget that in the early years of the Reagan administration, he was still dealing with some of the things like bad, poor inflation and stuff like that. Most of us, looking back on Reagan, remember like the good times, the boom years, but early 80s, 1982, like I remember on a personal note, like my parents were trying to get, a home loan and a car loan. It was still in like the 18-20% range. So things were not quite as great in the early Reagan years as we tend to remember them. But 1981, we have that assassination attempt. And I think that does a lot to garner sympathy and support for Reagan. I still think we have the mentally unwell.
Yeah, nothing's going to change that.
Nothing is going to change that at all. We're still going to have John Hinckley trying to get the attention of Jodie Foster. But are we just going to say, okay, more competence means on a broad level, like that doesn't happen? Or if it does happen, it gets shut down faster? What do we think happens? Is a Bob Dole assassination attempt going to happen? If so, does he get shot?
Yes.
Chris, take it from here.
All of those things happen. The one thing, the thing I think is different is we danced around this a little bit. Bob Dole was badly wounded in World War II in the Italian front. And he suffered some permanent health effects because of that. I think because of that, the publicity, the PR around an assassination attempt and how it is used is very, very different. I think different. I think Reagan was able to turn it into almost this very spiritual, like, revival. And I think if it is a Dole, the president is okay, the president recovers. There isn't the amount of information released about it. The president's health is kept in much more of a guarded status.
I see. Yeah, that actually that makes a lot of sense. Then that's interesting, and that would be kind of an interesting rabbit hole to chase after. A certain woodland creature of like if a this would be the two forks essentially. We have Bob Dole instead of Reagan, but then if Bob Dole actually gets assassinated, fully, that would be that would be a whole interesting thing.
He was also, not
as
shape that Reagan was, so he
not
was
as good
more
of health,
likely
right?
to have.
But because we don't like taking two forks necessarily and making things too crazy here, we're just going to assume with what we've built here that Dole survives and wins in 84. So, okay, so now let's get back to what I was saying for the lead up to changes in the Republican Party. So, Iran-Contra stuff probably still happens, but not as publicized. Domestic policy-wise, economy is probably going to be on a similar trajectory. The biggest thing that I think is the result of a Reagan-less 80s is how this impacts downstream Republican Party politics. As I've made reference to, Reagan, especially, I think it was kind of from my personal observation, I think the whole Reagan conservative thing hit very high water marks in like 2012, 2020, somewhat. 2016 was kind of a little bit, everybody paid homage to lip service to Reagan, but the Republicans nominated Mitt Romney, the most establishment Republican you could possibly
2012.
2012, one of the most establishment Republicans you could nominate. But there's still a lot of candidates that paid homage to Reagan in 2012. And in 2016, 2020, of course, we have Trump. With no Reagan and with no, moral majority as prominent, because of course we do have the moral majority voters, swinging for Bob Dole. Essentially, and this is kind of where I think we can kind of start thinking about the downstream impacts on politics. How do we think this changes the Republican Party's image of itself, I guess you can say? Dole's legacy versus Reagan's legacy. We have some interesting thoughts on that in the pre-podcast. So, Chris, take it from here. What do you think happens?
Yeah, first, I think that there is the moral majority, and I think actually Bob Dole fits very well within it, and is very welcome as a leader of that. I don't think you have the strain of economic libertarianism that you have it in throughout the Republican Party. That Reagan brings in, kind of incubates, and it stays around and is important today. I think you have more fiscal responsibility. I think that's what he brings to this. That is, and that doesn't necessarily conflict with the evangelical mindset. I think they still very much have a home within the Republican Party. I think that also really works well with what was already happening in terms of Nixon's Southern strategy, and in terms of kind of breaking up the Solid South, bringing in those voters. I think that is kind of the realignment you see, and what you don't see is the Reagan push into the kind of traditional. What Reagan did was he broke up the new. He put the.
He broke up the new. Yeah, the New Deal Democrats, essentially the labor powering. A lot of what the Democrats did.
Yes.
So I guess before I'm just gonna say something here as a side note. I feel Reagan was the culmination of like the Goldwater moment in the 60s. And essentially, like, Goldwater got destroyed, of course, by Johnson. With the not the New Deal. What was it called with Johnson?
Great Society.
Great Society. Thank you. But the seeds that Goldwater planted were sown and able to be harvested by Reagan to much effect in the 80s. So,
and I think that
go ahead.
That Middle America insurgency that Goldwater was, I think what you can have is, I think Dole can be that. It just doesn't have certain aspects.
If you think so, though? Yeah. Do you think so? Because I personally, I feel like Goldwater would have been seen as more of an aberration in my view. And, Reagan was much more in that mold, the more belligerent, as you said, with the Soviets, less predictable. Personally, and maybe, this can just be a point of nuance, I feel that Dole, with his more steady as she goes, more establishment Republican, not, of course, as establishment as John B. Anderson, the Rockefeller Republican. But personally, I kind of feel like Dole would have been seen more as a return to what makes the Republican Party work. And Goldwater would have been seen as he tried something that got, completely railroaded. I think if you try to make a link between Goldwater and Dole versus Goldwater and Reagan, I think it's not as strong of a link, personally.
The link is just traditional social conservatism.
Yes.
And I think that is something that Dole was very much on board with.
Right.
I think the one aspect missing from a Dole versus a Reagan is
the economic side.
The economic side, the neoliberal, the worshiping of the Chicago school. I think, Bob Dole is a reaction to the 1960s. Just like Goldwater was a reaction to the beginnings of those things. So I think he fits very well into that strain. And I think that strain of kind of the heartland American rock-ribbed values fit very well with Bob Dole and probably carry on a lot of what is today's Republican Party.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. So I think a good place to start wrapping this up, again, as we discussed in the pre-podcast, is what happens after 2 terms of Bob Dole. We got 1988. We have some major events that are right around the corner, but first we have to determine who's in the saddle. So H.W. Bush, we think, much like happens in our timeline, runs successfully and gets the Republican nomination. And what we discussed is, I think we said Dukakis was going to be the Democratic representative, the last gasp of the FDR New Deal, Great Society kind of Democrats.
New Deal, Great Society. There's a long strain there. And I think Reagan's success in blowing that up was why Dukakis was the last gasp of it, why you haven't seen Great Society Democrats since.
Turned into the Clintons of the 90s. Yeah.
Right. And I think what you have is, I think this may lead to Democrats staying Democrats instead of becoming kind of techno suburban types.
Interesting.
They stay more in the traditional Democratic base areas. You never see it contested if a Democrat's going to win Ohio or Pennsylvania. That's just a given.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's really interesting. So we have HW, as we think, winning,
and I think he still wins,
probably. And that, I think, and I think, Chris, you had one major thing that you wanted to talk about with H.W. Bush, but this is probably just where we kind of draw down things with the episode. But Chris, what's the one main thing that you wanted to cover that's very important?
We're looking at this, we're saying, where do we end it? We have to end it November of 89. The Berlin Wall still comes down. I think a Dole administration still outspends the Soviets, still pushes them, still challenges
the
them.
factors are still there. I don't think Dole goes to the wall and demands it's torn down. I think it just happens.
Right. I think it,
So it's a much less remembered part, I would say, of history.
I think the wall coming down is remembered.
The wall coming down is probably the more remembered part. In our timeline, we have Reagan demanding the wall be torn down as kind of more memorable than the wall coming down itself. So, okay, so we have that happening. And that's November of 89. That is, so wait, if I get my timeline correct.
Yep.
Bush is in the saddle at that point.
Correct. Bush takes over in January.
In January of 89. Yeah. Yes. So, but in terms of that event, I think we kind of did just in a couple sentences basically say what would be different. But it's much more of a focus on that as the event.
But again, I think economically, we don't have the crashes of the late 80s. We don't have kind of the Wall Street in all of what everything that movie represented. I think we don't have the Wolf of Wall Street. We don't have the savings and loans. We don't have all of those things. And I think that puts the American economy in a really different place.
And would that possibly mean that HW does not have what sunk his reelection, which is read my lips, no new taxes?
Right, because the taxes were never taken off.
We don't have a Ross Perot, I would argue.
Maybe,
maybe not. But I would say kind of, also hampered the reelection effort. So, yeah, I think that's actually really interesting. But what I was kind of getting at, and then we can kind of leave off on this note, is I think if we have more of an emphasis on the Berlin Wall coming down, we could be looking at the Soviet Union collapsing earlier. Because it collapsed in 91.
Correct.
Right? It's a little bit, it's still a rapid process, but still, I would say a little bit more drawn out. I think in our timeline, with the policy of outspending the Soviets essentially being the same, and if we have more of an emphasis on the wall coming down, I think the Soviets realized sooner under Gorbachev just how untenable the situation is, in my personal view. But Chris, what do you think about that?
So what are you saying that a Dole has a greater emphasis on the wall?
I wouldn't say a Dole, because again, remember, Bush is in the saddle at this point. But I would just say that because the backwards looking emphasis is not on Reagan making this big speech and then it happens, it's more so on the event itself.
So you're saying the wall coming down is a bigger shock than it was?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying. Thinking about that possible implication, I don't think that really changes a ton in terms of like the post Soviet world. Like if let's call it a year, like the collapse in 90 versus 91, I don't think that necessarily changes a ton.
I think it might actually be an interesting argument looking at what happened to the transitioning economies. If you don't have the focus on the worship of the Chicago School and the example of Reaganomics.
True.
I think a lot of the deregulation and a lot of the privatization that does happen in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe is a lot more responsible.
Yeah, actually, you have a really good point there. That's really interesting. But anyway, we do have to find a point to end things off here. So I think that's probably about as good a point as any. Unless, Chris, you have any other just burning random thoughts that have come up during the meandering portion of the podcast here.
No, I think we've done a good job there, keeping that to a limit.
Yeah, I know, because honestly, there is so much that we could have gotten into with a Reaganless world, but we did a pretty decent job of keeping it, mainly focused on the impacts during the tenure of when he would be around. So guys and gals and non-binary pals, if you enjoyed listening to this episode, please leave a comment, share it with friends and family. And we greatly value anybody who, visits the website, sends us an email, joins our Discord, and gives us some feedback and comments on, what you think. So yeah, just keep engaging the community on that. But we, of course, always value your time as listeners. And as we always like to end off our episodes here on A Fork in Time, if we happen to stumble across a fork in time on the road, What, pray tell, do you think we should do?
Take it.
Take it. See y'all later, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.